Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Food for Thought, which is a series of conversations where we talk with business owners, entrepreneurs, philanthropists, and thought leaders in the Jewish community. I want to thank our sponsor, the Hebrew Free Loan of San Francisco, for supporting our Northern California Jewish community for over 124 years. And this series is another way of offering resources and support to our community. My name is Roman Polner. I'm your host. And on behalf of the Hebrew Free Loans Business Circle, I'm excited to have this conversation with Alix Wall, whose name many of you may very well recognize, especially if you read the J, the New York Times, or anything about the local Jewish food culture. Alix is an award-winning journalist, a contributing editor to the J, the New York Times, the Jewish News of Northern California, Berkeleyside, and The Forward. Alix also works a lot in the food industry and is the founder of Illuminashi, which, as we'll later hear, is a not-so-secret society of Bay Area Jewish food professionals. And so, without further ado, please welcome Alix Wall. Hi, Alix. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
How are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Good. So, you're quite busy. You're a journalist, you're a storyteller, you're a connector, and I hear you're also working now on a film. Did I miss anything?
That pretty much sums it up.
Well, I really want to talk about the film. I'll save it for a little bit later because I know that it's a really personal project for you. And I think that a lot of our listeners will absolutely love to hear that story. But let's start with your career as a writer. As a journalist, tell us about where can people find you and what do you write about?
I like to say that I write about food, love, and Jews. And my career started really in Jewish journalism. I never intended to go into Jewish journalism, but I found that it was a really good fit. Mm-hmm. And in the Bay Area, I was on staff of the J, formerly the Jewish Bulletin of Northern California, for 6 years when it was still under Mark Klein's leadership. I started in 2000 and left there full time in 2006 to become a natural food chef. And that's kind of that leads to my next path, the food thing. But I always just found that covering the Jewish community was a really good fit for me because, I have a strong Jewish identity. I didn't even know Jewish journalism existed when I was growing up. I didn't live in a community that had a Jewish newspaper, but I moved to New York. I went to NYU for grad school in journalism and Middle Eastern studies at the time, and just fell into it kind of by accident and realized, oh, this really suits me because I care deeply about the Jewish community and Jewish issues. And so it was a really good fit. I've never really left it. But at the same time, my interests expanded outward, and I did leave journalism and remained a freelancer at the J when I became a natural food chef. And I did that for a number of years. And in 2011, I think Sue Fishkoff, the new editor at the time, offered me a different kind of food column where I would start covering interesting Jews in the food world. And that was maybe even it was earlier than 2011. I don't really remember, but it's been a long time. I'm still doing that column. I constantly get recognized. It's a very strange kind of fame where I'll be in Berkeley Bowl or something and be recognized by someone who reads my column in the J. I get recognized at farmers markets. It's kind of funny because my picture runs there.
Listen, you take, food, you take love, you take the Jews. It's a perfect trifecta. Of course, you're going to be a celebrity in the community.
Yeah, and the love thing actually started with the J. I started writing my own vows type stories for readers of that column in the New York Times. I've been a longtime fan of it. And I started doing my own in the J also probably over a decade ago when we needed something for the celebration supplement. And really, I was just trying to work my way up into the vow section of the New York Times. And it happened during the pandemic. And I've been a regular contributor now for over a year and a half. I appear regularly on Sundays in the style section. And it's like a dream come true. It's totally a dream gig for me because who doesn't love reading those stories? I mean, the news is so horrible on a day-to-day basis. And I think we need uplifting stories in the media. Otherwise it's just terrible every time you open the newspaper. So I think these stories give people a lot of hope and I like to think they help people by fortifying them to read the rest of the newspaper because, I don't have to say what's going on in the world. It's especially right now.
Well, that's a good point. And with everything that is going on in the world, and it's nice that you're bringing some lightness to all of it, and especially to the news. But I know that's in part connected to one of the stories you're most proud of that you were mentioning to me earlier. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so this was a Jay story that I was asked to write by, again, Sue Fishkoff, based on another story I had written. She had gotten word about a man in prison in Vacaville who had started a college program that had educated 1,500 incarcerated men, and he was never going to get out. He was called a lifer. He had committed a murder of a man who was threatening him and his wife. He was her ex-husband, and he was violent, and so he thought he was going to kill them. And he was a Vietnam vet and had PTSD, and so he took matters into his own hands and killed him. And he got a life sentence. And he just was determined that he was going to make the best life he could, knowing that he was never going to get out of prison. And his story was so inspiring. I went to Vacaville to meet him when he got transferred there. I should say that, of course, he was Jewish, which was how we found out about him. And what a story. I sat there for 4 hours and was just completely riveted by listening to him tell his story. And what was even more riveting after that was interviewing all the people that he had helped. And I ended up getting very involved in his story and going to Sacramento and testifying in front of the parole board. My story got to Governor Brown's office. We know for a fact because an investigator came to the prison and told him so that I'm here because we all read that story about you in the Jewish newspaper. And 2 years later, it took 2 full years to go through the parole process. But in January of 2020, he was released from prison. I was at the gate when he walked out. And it was a highlight of my life to be part of something like that. I think every journalist hopes that they can really make a difference for their work. And so few get to see the results like that. And he and all of his team, say that it was my story that did it. Of course, we couldn't get confirmation from the governor's office. They say they don't comment on individual stories, but it was really like a life highlight, not just a professional highlight, but a life highlight to be at the gate when he went free.
That's a really, really cool story.
People can find it by Googling my name, Alix Wall, Alix with an I, at the J website, and James White, that's his name. And Sneaky is his nickname. So if you Google those search terms, you'll find the story. It was written in March of 2018.
That's very cool. So What are you writing about now?
Oh, gosh. Well, I'm working on a story. My next vows couple for the Times is a lovely Black gay couple who are in their 60s who are getting married in Palm Springs this coming weekend. And I've done an interview with them, and they are one of them has actually lived in the Bay Area for years. We have a lot of friends in common. They're just so lovely, and I'm super excited for people to read that one. And then I'm working on my next J column. I always have like numerous stories that I'm working on at the same time.
So again, remind our listeners, you obviously have been writing for the J for a long time.
22 years.
20 years.
22 years.
22 years.
Almost, yeah.
You're now contributing writer for the New York Times?
I would just say I'm a freelancer for the New York Times.
Okay.
Contributing editor I have that at the J, but that's like a specific title. I'm freelance everywhere else. You can also find me in Berkeleyside, which is an award-winning news site that covers the East Bay. There's also the Oakland side, which was started more recently. I do mostly food stories for them, but I've sometimes am asked to do other things. I recently wrote a story about the former fire chief of Berkeley who got a kidney transplant. The donor was one of his best friends, and it was a very heartwarming story. They shared their story because they're both Asian Americans, and Asian Americans do not tend to donate organs as much as other cultures because of cultural reasons. So they wanted to raise awareness about that.
Cool. Well, we'll put, I think, links to all of these different publications so people can find you.
Sure.
But you'd mentioned food a number of times, and from your background as a chef and writing about food, and I'm sure that's in some way connected to your work with or founding of the Illuminati. So tell us about it, this not so secret food society.
Yeah, so with the help of the Schusterman Foundation, I started this group in 2015 is when I first had the idea after attending a conference that the Schusterman Foundation put on food professionals, Jewish food. And I had written this column for years. I realized, I'd been talking to so many Jews who worked in food. Oh, do you know this person? You don't? Well, you should know that person. And I've always kind of considered myself a connector more than anything else. And I found that I kept introducing people, and I realized at that conference that I went to, there were so many different people talking about future collaborations, but we were from all over the country. And I thought, wouldn't it be great if we had something like this for Bay Area Jewish food professionals? And no one had founded such a group. So despite the fact that I never really saw myself as a group founder, I founded it. And, it's kind of been a side project. It's not anything that, earns me money, but it does earn me a great deal of satisfaction. And it's been so much fun. I've had some great gatherings before COVID, of course. And there have been some great partnerships that have grown out of it. And that is my connection to Hebrew Free Loan, because a lot of people who have gotten loans in the food industry are sent my way by Cindy or people at Hebrew Free Loan, and vice versa. Sometimes I send, I know of people wanting to open a new business, and I tell them about Hebrew Free Loan now because I know about it. And so that's a really good connection to have.
Oh, and thank you for doing that. I know
My
it helps
pleasure.
everybody, and
My pleasure.
yes, thank you. Well, do you have any interesting or fun stories within the Illuminati, the connections that you've created that you want to mention?
Oh, well, I mean, I jokingly kind of take credit for the Square Pie Guys, which is a very popular Detroit style pizza restaurant that is about to open their third restaurant in Ghirardelli Square. They're in South of Market. There's one in Oakland. The founders are two young Jewish guys who cooked together, I believe, for the second time at an Illuminati event. And it was driving to that event and back that they talked about their philosophies and where they could see themselves in a couple of years. And they realized they both wanted to be owners and not just working for someone else. And they basically decided on that trip to go into business together. So I jokingly take the credit for, I mean, they're amazingly successful. They're really doing really well, and their pizza is delicious. So if you haven't tried Square Pie Guys, I highly recommend it.
Sounds like we'll need to put a link in our show notes to the pizza guys too.
Absolutely. Danny Stoller and Mark Schachter are the names of the two guys.
That's great.
Yeah.
And so they didn't know about each other, you're saying?
They did know each other. They had cooked together like once or twice, but they really, Mark had volunteered, like, at your next Illuminati event, I want to cook. And I said, great. And we had an event at a winery in Healdsburg where we didn't have food on site. And so I said, would you be willing to drive to Healdsburg? And he said, yes, if I can get help. And I think Danny had cooked with him once or twice before. So he asked Danny to come along, but it was my event, and they went and they drove there and back together. And, that's when they decided they wanted to maybe go into business together. So
there you go. You can add a matchmaker to your long list of accolades.
Well, that's what, I love being able to do that when I can. It's very satisfying.
Oh, that's wonderful. Well, I know that I think your whole professional career, you've been, as a writer, connecting the dots. Then you've been connecting people. And as a writer, you've been talking about, people's stories and putting them together, bringing them to life. And I want to shift gears because I know there's a very personal story in your own life that you're now trying to tell. And you're writing or are doing a film about it. So tell us about it.
Yeah. So my whole career, I feel like, has been leading up to in some way, because I do love telling people's stories and sharing other people's stories. And yet there have been so many times in my life where people hear my family story and they say, when are you going to write your own family story? When are you going to write that book? And for years I struggled with, I need to write a book about it. But I felt like as long as I keep writing about everyone else, I'm never going to, do this. And that's one reason why I became a chef for a while, in fact, years ago. And I couldn't find my way into this story. It's my mother is a child survivor of the Holocaust. My grandparents are survivors. I'm an only child. I'm not having children, which makes this all the more poignant for me, I think, because I feel like I want this story to carry on in some way. There was a song that was written in the Vilna ghetto by a partisan named Shmerke Katraginsky, who is very well known in Yiddish circles as a poet and partisan. He wrote many, many poems and lyrics to songs during the war. Apparently, my grandmother had a relationship with him while they were in the Vilna Ghetto that I never knew about because she married someone else after the war, even though he was interested in her then and she had already lost her husband. And he wrote a song about my mother and grandmother called The Lonely Child, Dos Altne Kind. And there's so many beautiful things about this song, but one of them is that it has no specific details about the Holocaust or the camps or Nazis or Jews or World War II. It's really just about a mother who's missing her child or a child who's missing her mother and her father. And it's so applicable to so many situations. I heard once a sixth grader who studied the song say in the film that we're making, something about it was if the writer knew that he wanted his song to live on and used in other situations, which I was amazed to hear a sixth grader say that. Anyway, I came together with a man, Mark Smolowitz, who's a Bay Area filmmaker. He and I went to UC Santa Cruz together. It was there that we both realized that we were each children of Holocaust survivors, specifically hidden children. His mother was a hidden child in Łódź, and my mother was in and we had been friends for a long time before we made that connection. Neither of us knew many other children of Holocaust survivors. I didn't grow up in a community where there were a lot of us, and neither did he. And so I always remembered that about him. And then we both found ourselves living in the Bay Area 30 years later. And I knew he was the one to help me make this film. And because it's about a song, I saw it as a film rather than a book that I would write, because I wanted to talk to musicians and hear different performances of the song. So really making this documentary is a way to ensure that the song will live on. For years, I thought I knew about the song, but I kind of thought that no one else really knew about it, or I wasn't aware people were continuing to sing it. And so once I found out that there were these stories that kind of appeared in my life that were kind of pushing me toward this, I needed to start investigating them and finding out who is singing the song, why does this song matter to them, who's keeping it alive today, and that's what the film is about.
And the film is called what?
The Lonely Child. Mm-hmm. You can find out more about it by going to lonelychildmovie.com. We recently received our first institutional grant to help us with the movie from the Claims Conference, which I think a lot of your listeners probably know is an organization that gives reparation money to survivors, as well as they have a film division, and they've awarded, many award-winning Holocaust films money. And so we are trying to match the $20,000 that they gave us at the beginning of the year. And it's been a long haul. I'm not going to lie. It's not easy. A lot of people warn me how difficult it is to make a film and to raise the money for it. But I feel really committed, and I have a very committed partner. And even though it's been a couple of years already, we're kind of determined to make it happen. So I want to just make a little request. I would love anyone listening to this, if you want to know more, to please go to lonelychildmovie.com. I do feel like I have devoted my career to telling the stories of others, maybe even your story. Maybe someone you love. For many years at the J, I wrote obituaries, and I spoke to so many people in the community that way. And knowing that I did a good job in telling their loved one's story as a final tribute was one of the most gratifying things I did at that time. And so I just want to say, if anyone listening to this feels like they want to help, we definitely could use it. And all donations are tax deductible through our fiscal sponsor, the National Center for Jewish Film at Brandeis University. All of this information is on our website, lonelychildmovie.com.
I was actually going to ask if our listeners are able to help, would they just be able to do that through the website? And I think you've answered the question.
They absolutely can. There's a donate link. You can also see some shorts. One of them was released with the help of the Jewish Film Institute a couple summers ago. Mark Smolowitz was a filmmaker in residence with them, and they featured one of our shorts. I think that was 2 years ago. I don't remember now. Everything is a blur with COVID, as you know. Time is a very loose concept.
It is. So let's go back for a second. You've talked about how the story came about, or how the song came about. Mm-hmm. Right? Is this man in the ghetto who
was in love with my grandmother.
With your grandmother?
Yeah.
But how did all this come around? How did you find out? I mean, it sounds like the song has been around for
Well,
so long that
yeah,
it,
my mom didn't. I mean, the sad thing, we're coming up on my mother's 20th yahrzeit next month. She died May 25th, 2002, of breast cancer at age 62. And it's so crazy because my dad and I talk now about like what would mom have feel about this movie, and what, she didn't know that my grandmother was in this relationship with Katraginsky. None of us knew that when I was a child. My mom, the song had been written about her, but she kind of forgot about it until she went to the opening of the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. in the 90s, found it on a computer there,
oh
and
wow.
she burst into tears because she knew it was about her. It even said on the screen, the song was written about, and it had her name. And at that moment, there was a group of middle schoolers that someone saw her crying who worked there and said, "Can I help you with something?" And she ran. My mom could barely speak, and she said, "This song, it was written about me." And the woman got so excited, she ran and got the ethnomusicologist there. His name is Brett Werb, sorry, Brett. And he came and was so excited to meet her. He had written his PhD thesis on Katraginsky, it turns out. And so there was this group of middle school children there, and my mom had never spoken to a group of school children about her story before, but she did it that day for the first time, and the song sort of motivated her.
I just got goosebumps hearing this
Yeah,
story.
it's
Oh my
it's
gosh.
pretty profound, and
Yeah.
it is really sad that now it's such a known fact that my grandmother, well, I don't know, known is a funny thing because of course it's such a small group of people who even
Hmm.
know who Katraginsky was, but a book came out a couple years ago by David Fishman, a professor at JTS, the Jewish Theological Seminary, called The Book Smugglers. And my grandmother is featured very prominently in that book, and he documents their love affair in the book. And so it's well known among certain people who care about this very small subject. But the other thing I should say about it is the conditions that my grandmother and Katraginsky were working in the Vilna Ghetto are worthy of mention because the reason this book was written, The Book Smugglers, it's about a group of Jews called the Paper Brigade. They called themselves that. They were tasked by the Nazis to go through, Vilna was this cultural
Hmm.
capital of Eastern Europe, and the Nazis have collected all of these artifacts that they were going to put in their museum of an extinct race. And they needed people who were fluent in many languages to go through all these items and select what was worthy of being kept for the museum and what was going to be recycled. And so they got a group of these slave laborers who left the ghetto every day. My grandmother was fluent in 5 or 6 languages. She had a master's degree at that time in history. And so she was one of these people who would go to the YIVO building every day, and they would sort through all of these items, and they would hide many of them in the building, smuggle them back into the ghetto. And they felt it was
Wow.
more important than trying to smuggle food back, was saving poetry and saving
Hmm.
books and saving, our culture. And that is a story that I feel like hasn't fully gotten its due either. And this book was written, but this is also my way of, I want my grandmother to be remembered for what she did. I feel like women's stories aren't often as told, of course, and people know who Katraginsky was, and people know who Avraham Sitzkever was, who was another poet in that group, whose granddaughter also recently made a film about him. He's he immigrated to Israel, and she felt like the Israelis never fully knew who he was because he wrote in Yiddish, and
Hmm.
he was never fully recognized for his contributions. And my grandmother was not a poet, so her name isn't out there in the same way, but she did this important work, and I'm incredibly proud of that. And I want her name to be remembered more so than it is right now.
Well, and we all have stories, we all have history, especially our people just have through that time. There's so many untold stories, but I actually have never heard the story about your grandma and how she found, and preserved all of these books. But it sounds like you're definitely following in those footsteps by continuing to, retell and preserve stories and make sure that they live on.
Yeah, I
That's
mean,
beautiful.
I can't compare myself to her because what she did was so heroic, and I feel like I'm just doing my thing, but the circumstances are so different. But thank you for saying that.
Well, thanks for doing that. It's incredibly important, and we're fortunate not to have to live in a time
Absolutely.
that's as difficult. Even though there are people around the world right now going through tremendous, heartache and pain as well.
Absolutely.
So it must not be easy telling and digging up all of the different points of reference to tell a story and to find out stories. What would you say is the most difficult part of your job?
Oh gosh. No, people not getting back to you in a timely manner.
You mean you deal with that too?
Oh gosh, yes. I mean, I'm not really an investigative journalist, so I feel like I don't spend a ton of time on a story. I don't really encounter, stories where people just don't want to talk to me. I think the hardest part about well, okay, yeah, I know what the hardest part is for sure. When I work on a story, and depending on what the story is, you always have pages and pages and pages of notes that you could turn into the story, but it's your job to determine what belongs in the story and what goes on the cutting room floor, as you'd say. And I really struggle with that because I always turn in my stories longer than they should be. I always want to write more. I always joke that I should be writing for the New Yorker because there they wouldn't care if I turned in a 20,000 word story. I don't quite feel like I'm wanting to write a book, but I often feel like, I can't tell the story in 1,500 words. I need at least 3,000, and that's hard because I often feel like, I still have so much good stuff that I could put in there, and I just can't. And I think there's someone famous said something about I couldn't write you a short letter, so I wrote you a long one.
That's right. Was it Twain?
Twain, yeah.
Sounds like it could have been Twain.
Yeah, I think it was Twain. And because it's harder to write, succinctly than to tell a longer story. But I always want to tell more. There's always more to tell. Always.
There's always more to tell, and it's so hard to get to the essence because there's just so many stories and there's so many elements, and they all intertwine just like they do in life.
Exactly.
Well, it's been so wonderful talking to you, and I do want to remind our listeners to visit the website. We'll put it on the show notes. Alix, remind us again what that domain is so that we can keep track and tabs on your movie, and if people are able to help you make it a reality. What's the website again?
lonelychildmovie.com.
Perfect. We'll put it in the notes as well. Any other thoughts? Anything you want to leave our listeners with?
Gosh. No, just continue to support Hebrew Free Loan. I love what they do. And I think, I am a firsthand supporter of so many of the businesses who have received loans from Hebrew Free Loan. So I'm just very grateful that they exist. And it makes me proud when I see, some of our Jewish food businesses, because those are the ones that I really track. When I see them from the ground up, like start from nothing and really build themselves into mini, empires, which I'm thinking of 2 or 3 in particular, like as Kneaded Bakery. I met her at Ileana Berkowitz at a Hebrew Free Loan lunch that Cindy invited me to some years ago. And her bread is absolutely phenomenal. She told me for my J column that she was going to make the best bread in the Bay Area. And I thought at the time, what chutzpah, but I really think she has. And a good friend of mine is Mika Talmor of Pomella, who opened her restaurant literally a week after shelter in place went into effect. They just celebrated their 2nd birthday, and then she's killing it. She's just doing so well. And it's just like so gratifying to see these businesses thrive, with the help of this wonderful organization. So thank you for doing what you do.
Well, thank you. It does take a community. It takes a village. And, Hebrew Free Loan is certainly there to help make the same connections that you do in your world. And it's that's how we work as a community. It's better together.
Yeah.
So for all of us listening who are in the food business, or if you're thinking about opening a restaurant or you are in the restaurant business, they should know about your Illuminashi blog. Is there a website as well?
There's no blog. It's just, yes, there is a website, illuminashi.com. We'll put that in the show notes as well. Okay. And anyone can reach out to me by emailing me, Alixwall, ALIXWALL @gmail. I'm happy to, add anyone to the list who's in the food business.
Awesome.
And identifies as Jewish in some way, I always say.
Well, thanks again for taking the time to talk to us. It was wonderful. Thank you for the shout out, and thank you for being a huge connector and a storyteller of important stories of people in our community. Alix,
Thank you so much for having me.
It's a pleasure. Be well.
You too.